I want to welcome all of you to today's installment of Reporting and COVID-19 Conversations for Journalists. I'm Bruce Shapiro, Executive Director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, the host of this ongoing series through the global pandemic, in which we are not only talking about innovative, effective coverage of the pandemic, but reporting through this difficult time and the many issues that it raises for us as news professionals. The Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma for those of you who are new to us, is a project of Columbia Journalism School devoted to effective, innovative, and ethical reporting on violence, crisis, and tragedy worldwide. We look both at the practice of reporting on people dealing with these difficult issues, and on the impact of reporting tragedy and trauma on our profession, and how to maintain resilience in the face of difficult stories. That's certainly the case of the pandemic, and that's the theme of today's conversation. I'm really happy to have with us today my colleague and friend, Dr. Cait McMahon, PhD, who's the managing director of Dart Center Asia Pacific, overseeing our programs not only in her own country of Melbourne, but across the region. Cait is a registered psychologist, but in a small group, among a small group of clinicians who have devoted their careers, and in her case, more than 20 years, to supporting journalists who deal with very difficult subjects. Cait is a pioneer in establishing self-care and peer support techniques for news professionals. So much so that she's the recipient, I think, 2 years ago now, of an Order of Australia medal.
4 years now.
4 years. We're all getting older, Cait. But an Order of Australia medal, one of Australia's highest civilian honors for her service to journalism. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have her here with us. For those of you who are new to this conversation, the way it's going to work is that Cait and I will talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it to questions from all of you who are with us on Zoom. There are also folks watching on Facebook Live. We don't have the ability to do questions that way. The way we will handle questions is to use the Zoom chat feature, which is, for those of you new to Zoom, at the bottom of the screen. Just enter your questions on chat, and one of my colleagues will be sort of filtering them and organizing them and sending them our way. Chat may also be where comments, thoughts, and other relevant information from you or from anyone else on the call can be shared. I should say that my colleague Susan Kaplan, a Dart Center Rockberg Fellow, is on this webinar in the background, lurking, but also making notes, because Susan has been assembling a kind of running tip sheet of journalist to journalist and expert to journalist advice for reporting in this era that is appearing as a rolling tip sheet on the Dart Center webpage. She'll be distilling counsel and advice that comes through this session. So we'll go for about 45 minutes altogether. Cait, it is great to have you here, and thank you for getting up at 7 in the morning, or being available at 7 in the morning, Victoria time. A little bit more reasonable hour here in New Haven, Connecticut. You've been working now with journalists for a long time, including people who have faced the most profound crises, assassinations of colleagues, natural disasters, covering sexual abuse and all kinds of other difficult issues. What do you see as, and what are you hearing from folks that are the distinct challenges for us as journalists in this pandemic, in this period now? What's special about this period for us?
Great. Well, firstly, I will pick up on that, but I want to thank you, Bruce, for the opportunity. But I also want to say g'day to, this is incredible, because I've been doing Zooms with only like 4 people, and I see friends from Israel, Northern Ireland, Korea, Amantha, who's also, there's lots of fellows, there's Tron, like, it's actually very cool. So I just wanted to say that I'm actually very excited to be here with you all, and thanks for the chance, and g'day all. Philippines. Look, what is special about this? Look, what I'm finding is that I think whilst there is a lot of trauma, of course, journalists that are working in areas where there's high death rates, where they're covering it, like certainly in the States and Italy and Spain, places where there are really high death rates, there's really high levels of trauma. But mostly what I'm hearing across the board, it's more about extreme levels of stress. And I think more than ever with this pandemic, it's very different because we're all experiencing it. You know, I mean, that's a no-brainer. It's like we all are. But it's, I think for the first time ever, journalists are not just witnessing a story, but are actually in the story.
Worldwide. I mean,
worldwide.
It's one thing when it's a group of journalists in one country that's experiencing a disaster or a civil conflict or something. But this is the first time the global tribe of journalists have shared a single set of challenges like this.
That's right. And so it brings up a whole lot of different issues, I think, when reporting on this sort of a story, because it's like, where does a journalist find that boundary between what's my experience, what's my high level of anxiety or stress, and what is that of the community, the public that I'm reporting on, which I am also part of. So I think there's some interesting challenges there about boundaries and potentially projecting your own stuff into stories, because it's like, what's mine, what's theirs, you know?
What do you think are some of the assets, though, that we're bringing as a profession to this? Because I think it's not only that this is a time of grief, loss, and so on. There are things in our work that have prepared us for this. What do you think we're bringing to this?
Yeah, great point. And I take that was your question in the first place. So sorry about that. But I think the fact that journalists are observers that do, even though I've said what I've said about the potential of boundary crossing, but journalists as trained observers have that ability more than the general public to be able to step back and have that reflection, because you folks have been doing this forever and a day. You have that ability much better than a general punter or someone like myself, because you have those skills of observing and looking at things at a distance, and then separating when you're crafting the story, of being able to separate and reflect better than the rest of us, I think. So that's a really important skill to be hanging on to at the moment, and to constantly reflect back on that. Which again, I think journalists have got that ability, that asset of reflection, review and reflection, and distance would be the three main ones in that, I think, are the real assets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think, if we want to build on those assets and acknowledge in particular the two issues I think you identified, which are the protracted no escape stress and the difficulties with boundaries that are multifaceted? A lot of us are dealing with that, the boundaries between work and home. We're all working at home, so there's family boundaries, there's boundaries in the community, boundaries with sources, boundaries with our own emotions. What are a few strategies that you think we should be especially aware of, how to address both the stress and the boundary interaction there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I think this, more than ever, more than any other trauma situation, this is more of an existential issue than anything. Yes, there is the death and that, but there's not it's not like a war where there's explosions and blood and guts and that sort of stuff. It really is an existential issue, I think. We've got governments that are operating at different levels, that sometimes we might feel the government decisions are threatening our personal lives by their decisions. There could be all sense of sort of rage about that. anger, fear, anxiety. So there's all these sorts of things bubbling around at the moment with this sort of an issue. And I think ways of dealing with that, with the existential issue, is about having that sense. We know from a lot of the resilience research that having a very strong sense of purpose and mission, having a strong sense of goal and the ability to almost writing a personal mission statement for yourself in these times about why this reporting is important, because it is so, so important that the public get accurate, good, ethical information at the moment. We're all desperate for that. So believing in the importance, I think, of the mission of journalism, that this is more than ever a vital time to be clear, accurate and ethical, and that it is such an important job. So that would be the first thing I'd say, is that sense of purpose and mission about what's happening would be the main underpinning, I think.
And on the boundary side, any particular ideas for dealing with that, which I think is overwhelming everyone I know, from, freshly minted, just about to graduate journalism students to crusty old veterans. We're all dealing with this confusing work environment, and how to, in both a functional way and in a psychological way. What are some things that seem especially helpful for the ways that journalists have to work?
Yeah. Look, I think in terms of the boundaries, I think of both the emotional, existential and the physical, and it is really important to physically disconnect from devices at times. And now I know that's really hard for journalists. I've known that for 20 years, that I always get pushback on that. But I think more than ever, because what's happening is that devices are no longer, like, we've now got the personal and the professional entering our own worlds. Like, there's no delineation there. The things that we might sit, and the device we watch YouTube on and funny cat videos is also the thing that we're getting horrible information about death, death levels and that sort of stuff. And also then the device that we're working on. So to make some sort of a delineation by just even switching off at times, just setting yourself a plan, almost like having a plan more than ever. And in the physical also, just doing stuff like exercise. Dart Asia Pacific has got, I think we've got 3 YouTube videos now of 10-minute yoga clips for journalists done by Kamina Lyle, who's the deputy director. And so physically having that boundary of getting up out of your chair and moving, because I don't know if everyone's like me, I'm sitting on my fat ass a lot at the moment, and, and eating and, drinking too much and eating too much and watching, so really having a bit of a plan, I think, just so that's around the physical. But the emotional, I also, just as I said that, I remember Peter Grester saying that when he was in prison and, there were so many people in the cell, it was really important.
This is Peter Grester, Australian journalist who was imprisoned in Egypt.
In Egypt,
for an extended period.
Yeah, and Peter talked about the importance of having the physical and the psychological space. When he was in prison for so long, they would put a blanket around one of the bunks, and they would give each person in the cell an hour or half an hour a day just to be on their own, to read, to, just to have that physical space. And I think if you're, like me, you're living with your partner or you're living on your own and stuck in, sheltering home, it's hard to even have that physical distance sometimes, or that physical space that's yours and separate. So creating that, but for the emotional side of it, making a plan, having a work plan that where you work out what you're doing throughout the day. So again, you've got some boundaries around what your work day is and what your home time is.
What about as colleagues? I mean, one of the things you and I talk often about is the central importance of peer support, of people being good buddies to each other professionally. There's a lot of research that supports the importance of that at a time when people are under threat or stress, or dealing with trauma. But how do you be a good colleague when we are apart, when we are working apart? What are a few of the ways that people might ramp up their being a good buddy game to
Yeah.
colleagues during this period?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great question. Look, again, we know the resilience research tells us that social support is one of the things that enhances resilience the most. Both giving social support or peer support and receiving it enhances our resilience. So it's really, really important that we have social connection now. People are even, you know, we've got this social distancing. Well, here, and I don't know if it's in the US and other places as well, we're trying to change that around to say, no, it's physical distancing and social connection rather than social distancing, because we're physically apart, but socially we must be connected because we're social animals. So I don't know, again, we've instituted here what we call FAD, Friday night after work drinks on Zoom. So Friday night at 5 o'clock Melbourne time, if anyone wants to join us, we get on with a group of journos, and we've made it a space where if people want to talk about COVID, they can, but we've also said it's a place where you can just hang out, do what you'd normally do at the pub. And, you know, we've had someone give us a piano recital, people telling jokes, people knocking over drinks and, you know, the usual sort of stuff. So creating spaces where you can have fun and humour. Another journo was organising a bit of a dance class. So I think we need a lot of ways of, you know, sort of using the social media stuff that we've got now to check up in generous and gentle and kind ways with each other, because there's a lot of shit going on out in the world there, but there's also a lot of really good stuff. So it might be about you just, if you're concerned about one of your buddies, one of your colleagues, sending a text, just saying, hey, how you doing? Creating an opportunity like this where people can get together, even having work groups. I've been talking with other journalists who have got a morning, they get together at 9 o'clock in the morning and have their work plan. They're all working, they're all freelancers working separately, but coming together just to have a work plan in the morning to share what they're working on, share ideas for stories, and then they go off in the day and you know, they meet each morning. So encouraging ways of using social media like that. But I'm very big on humour and having fun and using mindfulness and yoga at the moment as well to connect.
And what about if there's a colleague we're concerned about, if there's someone we're worried is having a hard time? What are a few things we might be looking for to know whether we should be really worried or not?
Yeah.
But B, how do we have that conversation? Because, you know, some folks, either with friends, professional colleagues who are freelancer talking to freelancer, or in the same news organization, you'll spend a lot of time with someone, even in this virtual time. We worry about colleagues seeing too much or getting wobbly or having difficulties. How should we think about that part of being a good colleague?
Yeah, look, just to know that your constant checking in is really helpful for most people. Of course, there will be some people that will need the clinical support, and it's important to have those resources up your sleeve if you can, or to encourage the person to find those resources. And the sorts of things that I would be looking out for with a buddy, if I thought, you know, I was concerned about them, would be if they are displaying more than usual, that you know, of their levels of distress or anxiety or negative self-talk, you know, spiraling down in negative self-talk more than they usually do. I would also be overt with that and say, hey, I'm noticing that you're just sort of, you know, viewing the world in a pretty much more of a shitty way than normal. How you're doing? And so overt that as much as you can within the context of your relationship. So most of us don't need to go off for clinical support. Most of us just need someone there who's going to constantly check in and be a listening ear, an educated ear. So learn about trauma. If you're going to extend that support, learn about what the trauma reactions are. There's a lot of stuff on the DART website about that, so that you feel comfortable that you can say to the person, look, this is really normal under these circumstances. You know, my levels of anxiety are higher, or you know, so maybe that's what you're experiencing. So helping to normalize for people too, because especially if people are in isolation and on their own, it's a bit crazy making really, and you can get stuck in your own head. So they're the sort of people that it would be important to follow up on too. People that are working alone, living alone, and who are buddies, to really look out for those folks, because it can be a mental head spin when you're just...
Yeah, we'll be going to questions in a minute, so folks and some of you already have, start to throw questions into the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. Cait, in a lot of my conversations with journalists over the last week, one of the most common things I'm hearing is a sense of guilt about a kind of complicated guilt, partly about, am I doing enough as a reporter, or my reporting isn't making a difference, partly about the relative safety and freedom that journalists have. So those who are reporting on the street, if they're with news organizations, may have access to PPE, personal protective equipment. Those who are reporting from home and are healthy are calling people who are sick. I'm finding, not all, but many colleagues experiencing a lot of doubt right now and a lot of guilt.
Yeah.
What's that about, and how can we address it either individually or as a community?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Bruce. And I think it gets back to my point that more than ever, this is about an existential issue. This is a really a significant existential moment that we are in. And I think that there's two things that come to mind with that. Is one, about checking your own self-talk around that. If we get into guilt and get stuck in our own heads around that, that's where we can go into that spiral that I was talking about. So really doing what I call a mental health check in the morning, and then maybe lunchtime and in the evenings, to check your own self-talk, your own well-being, and just almost going through like a little list of mental health, like we do when we're going out carrying cameras and doing physical safety checks, doing a psychological safety check with yourself, a review. And then, of course, if you're living at home, if you're on your own and you're in what we're calling ISO, I suppose you're all calling ISO, I don't know. Australians always shorten everything. So isolation, there's jokes going around about being in ISO. But if you are in ISO and you're living at home alone, that's where you need to check in with your peers. We need to do what's called reality checks. So if you feel you're moving into that guilt, you're moving into a headspace where those existential issues are just starting to overwhelm you, that's where it's vital to get onto your buddies, create your little peer support group and say, hey guys, look, do you think this is reasonable? Bounce it off your colleagues. I just want to check. I'm feeling really guilty. I'm worried I might have spread the disease. Look, can you help me think around this? So using our colleagues to get a reality check is really important, I think. So they're the two things I'd say, that the psychological sort of safety check in the mornings and the midday and in the evening, to do a bit of a review of yourself, but checking in with buddies and doing a reality check.
I've also had some folks say to me that they're finding a work journal really helpful right now. Not necessarily something you pour your guts into, but simply a list at the end of the day of what you accomplished and achieved, writing out any particular doubts or conflicts that you wonder about what's coming up next is simply a way of controlling and getting some containment around that, instead of holding it in and having it spin around and around and around in your head.
Absolutely. Yeah. Look, that's a really great idea, I think. And I've got some colleagues who are photojournalists who are doing stuff with photo journaling at the moment and putting stuff in, sort of the COVID photos that they're getting, but they don't want to be immersed in all the death and the horror and the pain of COVID. So they're also documenting and cataloging a lot of their really nice flower photos, scenery photos, to get that balance, because I think as journalists are so immersed in the story, it's not only are you living it, but it's also what you're reporting on. It's important to get a balance of the dark and the light, the death and the life. So making sure you get that balance as well. your mental mind space.
I'm going to adapt a question from Mark Cabra that's in the chat. We've been talking about mindfulness and meditation as being helpful. Given that we're all working, though, with a lot of fear and in a lot of isolation, are there any approaches that are more to meditation that are more likely to be helpful to what journalists are dealing with? And is there anything we ought to be careful of right now? Actually?
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, because mindfulness is not great for everybody. I know it's sort of the buzzword at the moment, and I practice mindfulness and I really recommend it. I think it's a really good thing. And in fact, I've got some mindfulness for journalists, little videos. Once I learn, Bruce, I'm the sort of the dark technology idiot. Once I know how to get the little videos off my phone to get them in YouTube, they'll be specifically for journalists. But we also should be cautious if you're a person or one of your buddies that is can be more dissociative, tends to move into that space where you're a bit disembodied. If you're that sort of a person prone to that, mindfulness is not actually good for you because it does take you further into that disembodiment space. Mm-hmm. So if you are prone to dissociation, it would be important to check in with a clinician as to whether this is good for you. Certainly a lot of clinicians do use it with people with dissociation, but they teach them how to do it and manage that. So just to put that as a proviso, as much as I love the modality, there's also that caution there. Look, for journalists, I think even if you want to start practicing, even starting with 2 minutes and building up, 2 minutes, then 5 minutes, and just focusing on your breathing. It doesn't have to be anything more special than that. And then your mind floats away, because we're all prone to what we call monkey mind. You start focusing on your breathing and then it's like, oh, I haven't put the bin out, and oh God, I haven't written that story. I've got that deadline in 20 minutes. And then you just bring yourself back to the breathing. So it's really a simple technique that can be used. Yeah.
And then related to that, if you're someone who has a lot of history of biographical trauma, or if you're someone who's had a history of dealing with depression or other mental health issues, how should we be thinking about strategies for this pandemic period? What should we be alert to, and how should we be thinking?
With if you're already experiencing that, person that brings that history. Yeah. Look, again, great question. Look, I think it's about doing that mental health check in each time during the day. That if you know you're prone to those sorts of situations, depression, anxiety, certainly just making sure you reflect on yourself and doing those check-ins on a regular basis. And again, using your buddies or your partner or someone close to you to just say, hey, look, I might not sort of read that my PTSD or my anxiety or whatever it is that you bring your history, I mightn't realize that I'm a bit out of kilter here. Can you just give me some feedback about how you think I'm doing? So if you've got someone close to you that you can do that check-in with, that would be a really important thing to do. Yeah.
One of our other colleagues, Alana Newman, also has suggested if you have a history of wrestling with difficult stuff, think about what's worked for you in the past, and bring it back now, whatever it is. If it was therapy, if it was exercise, whatever it is that has helped you cope at other difficult times, proactively bring it up now, because dollars to donuts, your issues are going to emerge at this time, right?
Yeah.
So a different kind of question. Salim Khan in Canada asks, how do you take a break when the news is coming in a constant stream and you're trying to stay on top of it? How do we think about that in a functional way?
Yeah. Look, that's a great question. What I've done, I went to buy a new headset the other day, and the only one left in town, I'm now living in a pretty small country town, was this big gamer's headset. I look like Princess Leia, with these sort of big ear things. But I found they're actually great to just sort of physically almost cut me off, wearing this big headset and plugging it into some I was listening to Yo-Yo Ma, and I thought nothing else can get into me at the moment while I'm listening to this music, so it's really about, it is overwhelming. It's incredibly bloody overwhelming. I've stopped reading a lot of news that I would normally read. So it might be about compartmentalizing and, again, making a plan about when you do immerse yourself in it. Because especially if you're writing or you're reporting on the story, to just have the overwhelm of the amount of information, we need to physically and psychologically shut off from that at some point. So whether your modality is music or whether it's visual, that you want to look at beautiful stuff, physically just walk, move, creating those boundaries, using that plan that you've created for yourself is really important.
The Thompson Foundation collectively asks, or some individual at the Thompson Foundation asks, with self-check-in, what do you actually ask yourself in a practical way? What does that mean? What do you ask?
Great question. So I've got a little checklist that if I was running a workshop, I would have it. And the checklist is, am I up today? Am I feeling more vulnerable than usual? Like, am I feeling physically sick today myself? Just not feeling, I'm feeling a bit more under the weather. Am I having emotional problems with my family? Am I fighting with my partner? Am I fighting with my kids? Are any of my loved ones not well today? All of those sorts of questions helps us reflect on where we are. So if I tick yes, yes, and yes, I'm fighting with my partner, I'm feeling physically, what we say in Australia, crook, feeling physically sick, and my kids are not well, you might still need to go to work on the story, but it gives you an indicator that you've got to up your self-care today. Okay, I'm in a bit of a vulnerable space today because there's a lot of stuff going on around me. So I need to make sure that at various times of the day, I take a little break, I do something nice for myself, I treat myself, but I give myself that psychological and physical break from the overwhelming information and the story that I'm working on at the moment.
And related to the kind of flood of overwhelming information, one of the questions that's floated up in the chat is in particular about managing social media. If you're on a social media desk, and at the same time, everyone in your personal social media space is talking about the pandemic, there really feels like no escape. What are some steps that people whose job is social media need to take, whether they are content moderators or verifiers or working journalists? What should we do?
Yeah, I'm really big on what I call nano breaks. The brain's neurostructure can't cope. And this is not because we're weak or not good at our jobs, but our brains physically cannot cope with a constant overload and overwhelm of death, destruction, disaster, negativity. So when I'm talking to managers and editors, especially, I say you must let your staff have little nano breaks, even if it's 1 minute, where you turn away from all the stuff and just look at funny cat videos or, a bit of Facebook interconnection or something a bit silly, something a bit funny, where you build in on an hourly basis where you have these nano breaks for a few minutes, where where you can break the cycle. And the brain needs this. It's not just a psychological thing, it's a physiological thing. Our brain needs to have a break from that. The neurotransmitters can't be overloaded. So we must have nano breaks where you just turn away, you just tell the boss you're going to the toilet or the restroom, and take your phone and look at those. I love that dog that rides a skateboard, just look at the dog on the skateboard, or something like that, really, really important.
Here's a different kind of collegial support question from Catherine Reed in Missouri, who teaches journalism, but her question also could be to those of us who are mentors to younger journalists. She says, I'm struggling with what to say to journalism students who are covering this crisis. On the one hand, worrying about their parents and grandparents and wondering what kind of a world they're graduating into, with fewer jobs than ever and the economic situation in journalism being what it is. when we're in a mentor role, how can we be helpful to younger journalists now or to
Yeah.
students?
Oh, that's a really big one because, I mean, who knows what the world's going to be post-COVID, But look, when you're in a mentor role, I think it's important to try and find a way to bring your experience to the fore, to help them learn. But the reality is we're sort of in this together. So there's an equalizing that's happening in the relationship, that whilst we're mentors and we're elders and we've got all this experience in another world, really, to be honest. But now we're here in this together. So I think it's about being honest about that to students, but also talking about things that you have learned in your career that you think you might be able to carry forward post-COVID, and get them to reflect on what is life going to be post-COVID, and what are the skills they're learning now that they think they may be able to take forward.
I mean, I certainly think one of the things I have found myself saying to students and to younger journalists now is that the adaptations and skills and the frustrations and challenges that they are overcoming right now are not only about this story, they are actually the ones who will be writing the guidebook for the next crisis.
Yep.
That
That's
what
good.
we are learning now is stuff that will change the way journalism is done.
Yes.
And so it's important to have a sort of culture of mutual learning where we're all
Yeah.
learning from one another and thinking consciously about, okay, this is actually about how journalism is going to be done the next time in the
Yeah.
fall, or in the U.S. fall, your spring, when there's another round of this pandemic or in some other global crisis.
Yeah, look, and that's what I mean about there's an equaling now about sort of the roles. We were in this together, and I think you're right, Bruce. That makes good sense. That who knows, we're all in this world of like, what is the world going to be like now? What is the profession? What's journalism going to be like? What is government going to be like? It's a very interesting time where we're doing again. I see Amantha Pereira's on there. G'day, Amantha, and Sherelle. Amantha and Kamina are looking. We're doing some podcasts now, asking journalists, what are you learning now from this? What's coming up? What are the questions coming up now that you think you might be able to carry forward once this is gone? What are the new things that are coming up? The new struggles, the new lessons that you can carry forward, because we're trying to look beyond COVID and not caught in the vortex. And I think about that, thinking about beyond, even personally and psychologically for each of us, what are the things I'm doing now? What is even one thing that I'm doing differently in my life now that's been good? Because there is some good stuff that's happening because of all this. Look at the pollution, the lack of pollution in the world. That's a fantastic thing. But what is one thing I'm doing in my behavior in my life now that I want to continue on in my practice, my life later on? So having a forward focus, I think, is important.
While we've been talking about being in ISO, I've learned a new word here. There are still a lot of reporters and a lot of photographers in particular who are still out there being deployed and are still on the front lines of this pandemic and of all kinds of other stories. And Kika Kirschenbaum, our Dart Center Ochberg Fellow and photographer in Israel, asks, how do you deal with the guilt of going into the field in this crisis and coming back home with the fear of bringing the virus home? How do we think about that?
Yeah, that's a really big one. Thanks, Kiki. I saw your question up there before. Look, I think no doubt you've got protocols, protocols of taking off your shoes, taking off your clothes. What's being recommended here for journos and for everybody is that you have an outside box, like a milk crate, where you put your keys, you put all your outside gear there, and basically strip off as you come into the house and go straight away and have a shower. So if we have these protocols that are being, certainly here, that are being embedded in us that we have to do, talking with the family, I think, as much as you can, sharing information. Information helps bring fear and guilt and anxiety down. So talking with the family about how you're going to do this together. And look, and to be honest, and I know you guys are out in the field more exposed, but every time I go to the supermarket here, I'm worrying I'm bringing it back to my partner, to my house, you know, stuff like that. We get food deliveries now, you know, so this is what is the difficult thing with this insidious sort of silent thing. We don't know where it is. We don't know what it's on. Anything we touch. Went to buy some plants the other day, and I said to Pete, my husband, you know, we shouldn't have done that because we don't know who's been there, who's been wheeling that trolley. So I think having protocols with the family and processes and talking with the family about that, allowing them to talk about their fears as much as possible, and just keep talking about it is very important.
And, you know, I've been finding myself saying about this and thinking that, first of all, there's a kind of assessment process that we ought to be doing, since there are both significant safety issues, even if you've got PPE and all that, there's significant risk to the self. And there's also an ethical issue because we don't want to become super spreaders, not just to our own families, but in society, right? So that's a kind of big claim. And we ought to have a kind of private or with a colleague assessment process for any assignment that says, is this one worth going out on, or is this one just as well done by phone? Like, you know, if we're going to go out, it should be, to the best that we can determine, valuable, necessary, and make a significant contribution to the story, not just reporting because we're accustomed to being on the street. And I certainly for photographers, that's a self-answering question, but for a lot of us, it's a choice to go out that should be made. And the related criterion I've been thinking about is not eliminating risk, which we can't do, but can we say we are minimizing risk? Have we taken, what are the steps we can take to minimize risk? What are the things that add risk? So how do we mitigate the things that add? And how do we minimize, you know, how we're mitigating risk? I think that's a kind of important thing. Here's an interesting...
And I think, if I could circle back, Bruce, I think that's what you're saying there. It's important, like the freelancers I was talking about that are getting together in the morning, you know, and sort of sharing their ideas and what they're doing for the day and the plan. I mean, that would be an opportunity where you could talk about that stuff. Look, I'm thinking about going out and doing this story, and hopefully your peers could say, look, you know, what's the news value in that, in actually physically going out as opposed to ringing, whatever. So again, using peers to do that safety check, physical safety check is important.
Here's a question that I know I have heard many times in the last couple of weeks. It's on the minds of many reporters and journalists. How do I manage friends and family who look to me like I'm a COVID expert? Am I responsible for keeping them informed when I'm not working? Sometimes they just want to vent and argue, and it's stressful to try to correct them when they're misinformed. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, look, again, it gets back to the boundaries issue. I think I was talking about earlier, that there does have to come a time where you just say, this is a COVID-free space, you know, and declare, you know, well, if you are an expert, fine, you know, you may well be, but if you're not, just to declare, look, I am not an expert and this is a COVID-free space. I've had to do that with as a psychologist, where I've had family wanting to ring me and, you know, sort of do mini counseling. And I just say, no, you know, unless you're paying me, I'm not doing it. and journalists can't take insurance. So, that's it.
Right?
Exactly.
You know, and I also think on that one that it's important to remember that your reporting is finally your best argument.
Yeah.
And I think that's, while the option of correcting people individually in our lives is always there, and we all have people in our families or social circles who either don't get it or who are being contrarian or are politically in a different place. When you're off duty, you need to protect that off dutiness, and it is your work. It's the job of journalism, the mission, to make that argument, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We're going to sort of stop in a minute. I think we're coming to the end of the time, but so I wanted to ask you one other thing, which is to kind of think about all the people in this room. And if you wanted to leave them with a little exercise, a little thought experiment, or that they might try when they get off of this webinar to up their self-care or social support game, or to up their boundaries a little bit, what would be a good exercise right now for folks?
Yeah, great question. One that comes to mind as I look out there, and I can't see any kangaroos this morning, but often there's kangaroos right out the window just here, true story, is to create in your own mind's eye what we call a safe place. So a place where you live, or a place that you like going to, whether it's the countryside or the beach, or indeed your lounge room with beautiful music playing, and having that as your safe space, your own internal safe space, that no one can take that away from you. So it's creating that visual and auditory safe space in your own mind, and even just closing your eyes. And when you're feeling overwhelmed, when you're feeling like you need to just get the voices that are on the social media and in your own head, even get those out, to create that bit of space, to take yourself to that beautiful, safe place. And if you want to include it in some deep breathing, you can do that. But just taking 5 minutes, 10, 15 minutes a day to immerse yourself in that place, that visual imagery. But also, don't just do the visual. Imagine the sounds that come with that. If there's the sound of the beach rolling, take yourself back to the fragrances and the smells that are part of that. Immerse yourself in that imagery with all your senses, because the brain doesn't know, if you're immersing yourself fully and imagining you're there, your brain doesn't know whether you're actually there or not. So it's like being there. So again, it sort of fits into that creating a space for yourself, repeating myself, but yeah, immerse yourself in your full senses for that place. So choose one image, one place, and practice it on a regular basis, on a daily basis.
That's a wonderful place to wrap this. But before we go away, first of all, if everybody could turn on your video, even if you're in your pajamas, because we want to take a collective screenshot of everybody. And could we do a big wave of acknowledgement to Cait, a big thank you wave to Cait, so we can do some screenshots. Keep waving, because there's still some videos to come on. Come on, folks. All right.
I want to get a photo. Am I allowed to get a photo? Is there anyone who doesn't want their photo taken if I take a photo of that? Turn your camera off, if I can do that.
Go. Ariel will send you a screenshot anyway.
Excellent.
I want to thank Cait for joining us today. Now you all know why we so enjoy working with her here at the Dart Center. I would invite you, first of all, to attend Cait's virtual drinks and to check out Kamina Lyle's Yoga for Journalists sessions. I want to thank Columbia Journalism Review, our colleagues in New York who have co-sponsored and helped promote this conversation and the whole reporting on COVID-19 series. My colleagues Cait Black and Ariel Richen, who have been driving the car behind the scenes. And again, Susan Kaplan, who is boiling this down into this rolling tip sheet on www.dartcenter.org and on our connectable as well through our Facebook page. I want to thank Yusu for doing all of that, passing this knowledge on to a much larger pool of journalists. Thank you to those who are lurking on Facebook Live. We know you'll be passing the lessons on to other colleagues. We'll be back next week with a couple of other sessions. Thank you.